Well, kia ora koutou, ko Andrew Tait tōku ingoa. I'm the Chief Scientist for Climate, Atmosphere and Hazards, based in Wellington, Niwa. It's my great pleasure today to give you this presentation on climate change in Tairāwhiti. I'll talk for about half an hour or so, and then I'm very happy to take questions. So let me just share my screen and we'll get going. Great. Okay, so let's start off with some very sort of high-level messages. So Tairāwhiti is gradually becoming, and actually just focus on that word becoming because it's already happening. This is not something that is a future change only. It is actually, climate change has been happening for some decades now, slowly. And as we move further into the future, those changes are likely to become more obvious and impact on us more greatly. But a point there is that the climate of Tairāwhiti is already changing and is gradually becoming hotter, as is all of New Zealand, and in fact all of the world. The primary response of increasing greenhouse gases in our atmosphere is that the climate is warming. That's why it's often called, climate change is often called global warming. The region is also becoming drier. Now that's not consistent across all of New Zealand. Some parts of New Zealand are getting wetter or projected to get even wetter, like, for example, the west coast of the South Island and parts of Southland, western parts of the North Island even. Whereas other parts of New Zealand are projected to get drier, and that does include Tairāwhiti. It also includes areas along the east coast of the North Island and South Island, as well as in Northland, for example. And that really is to do with the changes in the wind patterns. So warmer and drier. The consequence really of both of those things, hotter and drier, is that the region is already becoming more wildfire prone, and that's mixed up also with the type of vegetation that is across the region. So where in particular there are large areas of forests or native vegetation or even tussocky grassland, then those vegetation types, in combination with a climate that's warming and drying out, means that wildfire is becoming more and more of a risk. It's also becoming more flood prone, and that might seem contradictory when I'm also saying that the region is getting drier. But the difference there is that the average rainfall, if you like, over a year or over the season is getting less and is projected to continue to get less. But these extreme rainfalls, where we get big, heavy downpours over a few minutes to a few hours to even to a couple of days, that are the extreme events that really cause a lot of problems like flooding. For example, the picture on the screen. Well, those types of events are also likely to increase in their frequency. So it's a combination of a gradual drying trend for the region, but also these extreme events like these very, very heavy rainfalls, which lead to flooding, are also likely to increase. Now, these trends here that I've talked about that are hotter, drier, and more wildfire prone and more flood prone, this will continue for at least the next 50 years because a large amount of what the projected changes are already what we call sort of baked in, right? And that's because we've been putting extra greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide into our atmosphere for a long, long time. And the global climate takes a long time to readjust to all of those increases in gases that are in our atmosphere. So we will see continued climate change for quite some time, even if we were to turn off all of the greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow. That's not going to happen, of course. So, but we obviously want to try to reduce those emissions from now on, so that the changes that we will see in the future aren't as extreme as what they possibly might be. So what may the future hold? Now, the key word in that title is may, because we haven't got a crystal ball. We can't tell you exactly, or tell anybody exactly, what the future will hold in terms of the future climate. All we can do is simulate the future climate using these very sophisticated global climate models that have all of the physics of the atmosphere and the ocean and the terrestrial biosphere and our cryosphere, which is our ice content, snow and ice content on the globe, included in those models. We can run what are called, using those models, we can run what are called scenarios. So these are what ifs. So if you go, well, what if the future pathway for greenhouse gas emissions was quite low? In fact, it might end up being on one of these pathways here on the picture, say that green line, which means that we're still increasing those greenhouse gas emissions through to about 2030, but then they stabilize globally and even tail off a little bit. The label on that green line is RCP 2.6, and RCP in the world of climate science that I live in is referred to as a representative concentration pathway. So it's a pathway. So that means that it's a line that exists over time. You can see the axis there on the bottom is from the year 2000 all the way up to the year 2100. So it's a pathway of emissions or concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere over the time. That pathway, of course, is, well, I guess what you might call quite optimistic, but we are obviously, as a global community, trying our very best to go on that pathway, because that would lead us to the minimal impact of climate change if we kept those emissions globally low enough to stay on that sort of pathway. We don't know if that's going to happen, obviously. There are all sorts of factors that go into greenhouse gas emissions globally, and we could be on one of these other pathways. And these four representative pathways that are on the screen are often used in climate modeling to explore these what-if scenarios. What if we were on that very low pathway, the green one, RCP 2.6? What would be the climate changes globally and locally associated with that? Or what if we were on one of these other pathways, like RCP 4.5, which is a kind of a middle to low pathway of stabilization, but later in the century at a higher level? Or some of these more extreme pathways like RCP 6.0 or even RCP 8.5, which is one of the most extreme pathways that has been modeled. So we have these multiple scenarios of what ifs, and we're able to use those what if scenarios in the global climate models and then come up with what it means for the future climate globally and for New Zealand. And you can see that the range of these scenarios at the end of the century, at the right-hand point of that plot, is very large. And that represents this very large uncertainty that we have about the future. It could be that we could be on that bottom pathway. It could be in a very extreme situation that we're near the top of the RCP 8.5 pathways. We have to be able to model what the climate looks like under all of those scenarios, and we can use these scenarios to understand about all of that uncertainty in the future based on future choices around greenhouse gas emissions. And then typically when we start to look at these climate changes, we pick a couple of time periods to focus on, and often for policy work, both at central government and regional government, as well as informing businesses and communities, a good two useful time periods is one that's about the middle of the century, somewhere around 2040 or so. And then another good one is at the end of the century, or around 2090 or so. And we compare both of those future periods with the current climate. So I'm just going to go over now what some of these future climate projections look like for those types of periods. Now, the opening slide, I talked about some key messages. The first one was that the region, as well as all of New Zealand, is projected to get hotter. And one way we can look at what that impact is in terms of heat wave days. And a heat wave day is counted if there are 3 consecutive days with maximum temperatures above 25 degrees Celsius. So then we can count the number of times we get these heat wave days over a whole year. And the note there on the right-hand side says for Gisborne City, there's around about 25 of these heat wave days at the moment per year. What I'm showing here in the picture, these are 2 future time periods. The left-hand side for that middle of the century, somewhere around 2040. I've got an actual 20-year period here from 2031 to 2050, averaged over that period. But a mid-century on the left, and then an end century on the right. And this is showing the projected additional heat wave days over what we currently get. And it's for one of those low to medium emission scenarios, the RCP 4.5. So this is like a sort of an optimistic picture of what we would expect in terms of the changes in heat wave days. And you can see that there's a variation across the region. And that the greatest increases in heat wave days are in the coastal areas and inland in the southern part of the region, where on the left-hand side, you can see for the middle of the century under this scenario, we're expecting about another 10 to 20 heat wave days. So not quite a doubling of what we've got at the moment. But if we're on that, and then by the end of the century, on the right-hand side, that number could get up to 20 to 40 more heat wave days. So like a 1.5 times up to maybe even close to 2 times the current numbers of heat wave days. So that's for a low to medium emissions scenario. And of course, the benefit of doing different scenarios is you can do what ifs. So what if we actually were facing that very high emissions scenario and continued on that very high emissions pathway. Now, I really hope that we are not on this pathway, obviously, because the changes get quite severe, particularly at the end of the century. You can see that on the left-hand side, this is the middle of the century. That number is actually not too different from the low emissions scenario. It's about 10 to 20 more heat wave days. And if you recall that plot I showed you with the different scenarios, by the time you get to the middle of the century, there isn't much difference between the scenarios. The variation, the range is greatest, obviously, at the end of the century. And that's where you see this really intense increase in the number of heat wave days if we're following this very high emission scenario. 40 to 60 more days. So that's a doubling to a tripling of the current number. So that's quite an extreme projected change. And we can start to think about what those types of changes to heat wave or other temperature-based indices means in terms of the impact. There's obvious things like, this is going to be really much more create much more discomfort for people working outside, like in construction industry or forestry, for example, or in agriculture, having to endure more of those very hot heat wave type conditions. But there's also, you can think about what it means for animals that obviously, in New Zealand, we have pasture-based agricultural system. This is an index which is called the temperature humidity index. So it includes humidity as well. And we can start to calculate the change in these types of indices based on those temperature changes. Now, for the temperature humidity index, where we've got sort of moderate heat stress, we use currently for Gisborne, we get about 6 to 8 days of that moderate heat stress per year. If we have the type of temperature changes that I've been showing in the previous slide, then those numbers could be added. There'll be more of those by between 4 and 10 days per year by 2040, depending on the emission scenario. And at the end of the century, we could have 8 to 14 more days compared with now, which is obviously doubling or even trebling what we currently have. And so the impacts of these types of temperature changes can then be looked at in particular sectors like agriculture, for example, and animal welfare. So that's the type of science and utility of these types of projections that's going on all the time. When I said drier, I mean, generally speaking, the rainfall will be down on what we currently get, like the annual totals. And the numbers are not great. They're about 5 to 10% or so less than what we have now. But where that really these drier conditions really show up greatest is in things like drought. So what we've got here are two future periods. The left hand is the middle of the century, and the right hand is the end of the century. And we're looking at a low to middle emissions scenario. Both of these pictures aren't too different from each other, but they're showing that the yellow here is the additional amount of what we call potential evapotranspiration deficit, which is a drought indicator. So in these pictures, that yellow color is about from 100 to 150 millimeters of additional PED, and that equates, if you look on the right-hand side, that about every 30 millimeters of extra PED equates to about another extra week of reduced grass growth. So if we all the way up to sort of 150 or so, then that's sort of 5 weeks. 150 divided by 30 is 5. So we would say another 5 weeks of extended drought period where you would have reduced grass growth compared to today. So those numbers are really useful to try to understand whether or not our current, particularly farming systems or irrigation or water supply is still going to be fit for purpose under these drier future climates. Again, we can look at the other emission scenario here, the very high emission scenario. There's not too much difference in terms of the mid-century projection. As I said before, the real differences start to show up at the end of the century under this emissions scenario. And here you can see there's a lot of part of the region that is now 150 to even 250 millimeters of additional evapotranspiration deficit. So now you're talking about, 5 to 8 or so extra weeks of dry conditions where you have reduced grass growth, for example. So that's quite severe. I mentioned wildfire risk, and this is very much aligned with those changes both to temperature, warming climate, and to reduced moisture or rainfall. It does increase the wildfire risk, and where in particular you have land cover of readily combustible vegetation like trees or scrub. And here's some numbers just based on some work that was done in the past on the change in the number of days of very high and extreme forest fire danger. So that's projected to increase by about 30 to 40% for the region by 2090. That range 30 to 40 depending on those emission scenarios. And that is example just at Gisborne city, that would be currently we have very high extreme forest fire danger on about 34 days every year. That would go up to around 44 days for the year on that high emission scenario. So another 10 days on top of what we currently have. And the note here is useful for us to consider as well, because what's driving these climate changes, of course, is as I said, the changes in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the concentration of greenhouse gases. And one of the key greenhouse gases is carbon dioxide, which is being emitted when we burn fossil fuels, like burning oil and coal, for example. Carbon dioxide, of course, is what vegetation breathe in and use to store carbon to grow bigger, for example, in terms of the width of the trees or the height of trees, for example. And so by increasing levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we can actually enhance the fuel loads by increasing the vegetation productivity. Now, that's very highly dependent on things like water and nutrient availability as well. But there's lots of modeling that looks at both this increase in vegetation growth associated with increased CO2 in the atmosphere, and how that then links to the risks like forest fire risk or wildfire risk. It's quite a complicated sort of situation where you've got two driving factors there, both the CO2 and the climate. Lastly, I want to talk about these, changes in extreme events and heavy rain and floods. And of course, we've had our fair share of those across the region recently. What's driving these changes of heavier rain and more floods is that as the climate warms, as their atmosphere warms, its ability, I guess, in terms of the atmosphere, its ability to hold more moisture in these very intense storms also increases. So basically, these storms are more potent because a warmer atmosphere can hold more water in the storms, and then it rains out more water, and that creates the problem of more flood risk. And here's some numbers just to give you an idea about what we're talking about here. So example, just a short duration heavy rainfall that lasts for only 1 hour, we're expecting about a 12 to 14% increase in the amount of rain that storm could hold for every degree of warming. So 1 degree, if we have 1 degree of warming, then we have another 12 or so percent of moisture in this storm. If there was another degree of warming, like 2 degrees total, then we would double that. If we had 3 degrees of warming, then we need to triple that increase. And so you can see that there's this very, as we get more and more warming, the increase in the intensity of these short duration rainfall events, or even going out to, the sort of rainfall events that we had with Cyclone Gabrielle, increase quite rapidly, and can mean, and this is really where a lot of the guidance around, we are expecting more intense rainfall comes from, this relationship between temperature and the ability of the atmosphere to hold more moisture. And just an example of what this means for somewhere in the region, I've picked out Te Puia. That means that 100-year return rainfall for a 1 hour duration event. And it's actually, it's more appropriate to think about these in terms of what's called the AEP, which is the annual exceedance probability. So a 100-year return period is actually the same as a 1% AEP. And that means, like in yellow on the screen there, the chance of this event happening in any year there's a 1% chance. So that means that you could get this type of storm happening every year. There's a 1% chance it's going to happen this year. There's another 1% chance it will happen next year. There's another 1% chance it will happen the year after that. It's a better way to conceptualize these storms rather than a 100-year return period, because often the message gets mixed up that if you've just had a 100-year return period rainfall or flood, then you're not going to get another one for another 100 years. Well, that's not right. You could get another one in the next year, or even in that same year. There's a 1% chance that might happen. Getting on to these numbers then. So a 1% chance of a heavy rainfall in the current climate for a 1 hour heavy rainfall is 70 millimeters. So that's equivalent to the 100-year rainfall number for a 1 hour rainfall at Tupuia. 70 millimeters per hour will give some flash flooding and some problems with drainage and stormwater, etc. If we take that same 1% event and look at it in 2090, so we're right at the end of this century, even under a low to medium emission scenario, the number becomes 82 millimeters per year. So that means that a 1% storm in that future period is going to have much more rain than it currently does, 82 versus 70. An interesting way of also looking at these numbers is that if you take that 82 millimeters and if it fell today, then the percent chance that would happen is a 0.4% chance, or you can think about that as a 4 in 1,000 likelihood, which also can be represented as a return period as a 250-year return period. So that means that that 82 millimeters that we're expecting in the future for a 1% AEP is going to, if that fell today, then that would be a much, much rarer event, a 250-year event rather than a 100-year. The reverse way of looking at that is that the 70 millimeters that we currently get today, which is our 1% AEP, if that fell in 2090, it would be about a 2% AEP, i.e. half the return period, around a 50-year return period. So all of that information, I guess, is summarizing the message that we're expecting these types of storms to be more intense in the future. And the types of storms that already cause us problems, like the 70 millimeter per hour, are going to happen more frequently as well in the future. So I just want to finish off this talk. And again, I'm happy to take some questions after this by just pointing out some really key resources that if you can look up online if you want to learn more about climate change in Tairāwhiti. And the first resource is the Gisborne District Council. They have some really great web pages on climate change under the environment section on their web page. So I would suggest that that's a first stop, a first port of call for understanding more about climate changes for the region. There's great stuff, if I may say so, on the NIWA webpage, on the website. And one of the websites here that I've highlighted, providing climate change advice for New Zealand, is where we have got links to national scale information, as well as regional variation across New Zealand. And we've produced a number of reports for different regional councils and district councils around New Zealand that focus in on these same sort of scale that I've showed for Tairāwhiti. So you can look at, for example, that same sort of information for Southland or Canterbury or Northland on that webpage. The Ministry for the Environment is the central government agency that is responsible for providing information on climate change from a ministry perspective, from a ministerial perspective. And they've got some great web pages there which focus in on the regions as well. And so you can search for climate change for Gisborne region and Hawke's Bay regions. And they've got some nice summary information there, which include things like sea level rise, which I haven't talked about today. And finally, this is a report that we produced a while back now, but it's available on the NIWA webpage, and it's called The Climate and Weather of Gisborne. And it is summarizing what we know based on things that we've measured in the past. So we've measured rainfall and temperature and humidity, and we created these drought indices like the PED, and looked at impacts like flooding. So these reports are really useful because they're a summary of what we know about the region based on the data that we've collected in the past at our climate stations and other observational sites. So that's a really great resource as well. So look, with that, I just wanted to say thank you very much for your attention. It's been my great pleasure to present to you today on this important topic of climate change. And I'm more than happy now to address any questions that might have come through. So I know there were some questions that had been sent through earlier. Could perhaps start with those. So here's one. What are the tipping points and how are they incorporated into NIWA projections? It's a really good question. Tipping points are things that if you go over that point, then it's very hard to reverse from that. So for example, there might be a tipping point where due to changes in the climate, a certain species of native plant just can't tolerate the new climate, and so it becomes extinct. Well, that's a tipping point because there's no way that that species can survive after it's become extinct. Another idea around tipping point, more climatic one, is that things like the West Antarctic ice sheet in Antarctica, it could get to a point where it rapidly melts at a tipping point of change of the temperature increase and a global temperature increase. Once that tipping point is exceeded, and that ice sheet starts to melt rapidly, then there is no turning back from that. It's going to continue to melt and cause significant increases to sea level. So the question really is about, are these tipping points included in the modeling? They actually come from the modeling. You can start to look at those, the modeling work, the global models and the regional modeling that we do in New Zealand allows us to examine if there are tipping points in various areas like species survivability or ice sheet dynamics. So in a way, it sort of comes out of the modeling rather than being incorporated in, but it's an extremely important concept because you can't come back off some of these things. You just can't come back from once you exceed the tipping point. So let me jump on to the next question. Have the weather events over the past year or two changed the future weather models for this part of the country in any significant way? Yes, no, that's a really good point. Obviously, we've had a number of events, and some of them very significant, like Cyclone Gabrielle. The way that climate modeling is done is that it's a global effort. So New Zealand scientists are involved in that global effort, but so are Australians, Americans, the UK, the Chinese, everybody basically around the world has climate scientists that are contributing into a really concerted global climate modeling effort. And these global climate models are based on the very latest information all the time in terms of the events that we've seen, the storms that we've seen, the changes in things like El Nino and La Nina, which are really, Pacific climate drivers, the Central Pacific climate drivers. And they're forever these institutes around the world are forever working on trying to improve the representation of our climate in these models. You can think of these models as being, they're massive. They require huge supercomputers to run because they're trying to resolve the way that all of our weather and our oceans and our land, etc., and our ice masses all interact with each other, every few minutes in the horizontal domain as well as the vertical axis. And they're showing these interactions across those horizontal and vertical domains very, very quickly in terms of the changes in moisture fields, the changes in energy, and the changes in momentum, etc. They're all physics-based. And these models are simulating what we actually see in the atmosphere, in our global climate. And in some cases they're doing that simulation very well. For example, the sort of changes that we see seasonally or annually, or things like the influence of the ocean's temperatures on the air temperatures. And some things we've still got a lot of work to do to get these models simulating well things like these extreme events, like these big cyclones and storm systems. But the message is that as we see more of these things, and we understand how these storms can be modeled and represented in these models, then the modeling effort, global modeling effort, continues to get better and better and better. And so we continue to advance our ability to simulate these types of systems. And then we can look into the future and understand what the changes we might see in terms of the frequency or intensity of those systems. So it's an ongoing effort. And yes, every time we get a storm like this, it helps that understanding and that next generation of modeling effort. I'll grab the next question. So how much can Cyclone Gabrielle be attributed to anthropogenic climate change? Okay, that's a good question. I'll get to that one on attribution. The eruption in Tonga, or just the ongoing weather cycles over the past 20,000 years? So there's kind of three parts to that question. So attribution is an interesting scientific topic. What we're trying to do with attribution is say, the storm we just saw, for example, Cyclone Gabrielle, how much of that storm can be attributed to the changes in greenhouse gases in our atmosphere that we have seen based on burning fossil fuels? In other words, is the climate change contribution to that storm? The only way you can really do that, and thankfully, the only way you can do that is through modeling, and we're good at doing climate modeling, and now we've had a long history of doing this. We can run a climate model or several climate models with the same amount of greenhouse gas concentrations that we had in the atmosphere 100 years ago. So we say, okay, what if, this is another one of these scenarios, what if there were no changes to those greenhouse gas levels, carbon dioxide, etc., and then we can run those models with that baseline level of greenhouse gases, and we can simulate the climate based on that, right? And we can simulate it all the way out to the end of the century, and we can look for these types of extreme events in those models. And we can then count these extreme events or look at how intense they are and analyze the frequency and intensity of these extreme events from those simulations. We can then run another set of models where the change in the greenhouse gas concentrations actually matches what we have seen over the last 100 years and various projections of those changes going forward in time. And we can run, with those changes in greenhouse gases that we have seen, we run again the climate models, we again look at these extreme events, we again count their number and look at their intensity, etc. And then we can look at the difference between them. What we call a naturalized world, where greenhouse gases didn't change, and the real world, what we've seen, where greenhouse gases have changed. That counting and analyzing of these extreme events under those two types of worlds is the way that we can attribute the climate change contribution to these types of storms. When we did that type of analysis using the rainfall that fell during Cyclone Gabrielle, the number was about 10 to 20%. So the contribution or the attribution of that storm from climate change was an additional 10 to 20% intensity over what the rain that would have fallen under those same sort of weather conditions if we didn't have greenhouse gas concentrations as high as we have now. So that's how we do attribution science. And the number that we got for Cyclone Gabrielle rainfall was about 10 to 20%. So that's the current, if you like, contribution of climate change to that type of storm. Other things like the Tonga eruption, the models as they are being developed are incorporating things like, well, all of the particulate matter, etc., that's erupted into the atmosphere from volcanic eruptions is included in these models to try to understand the impact of those types of eruptions on the climate. And it can be quite a different types of interactions, just depending on what gases are released, the amount of particulate matter, how high that particulate matter gets into the atmosphere, right up into the stratosphere, for example. So those types of volcanic eruptions that are, particularly the very large ones, are the effect of those eruptions is actually incorporated into the modeling that we do and global modeling that we do. So in a sense, it's trying to simulate, these models are trying to simulate that type of effect. So it is included. And then the last part of that question was kind of just all about the sort of natural variations over the last many thousands of years. That is absolutely, the models themselves are can be run back in time for thousands of years and have been to look at very, very slow changes in our climate associated with the ice ages, for example. And so that's more around the sort of planetary cycles of the wobble that we have on our planet's axis and the eccentricity of our orbit around the sun. So those things, those sort of more what we call, I guess, natural climate cycles and ice age type cycles are definitely part of that is all part of the physics that's included in these models. So it's like I guess trying to understand the natural part of the way that our climate behaves, and then we can do these simulations where we add extra greenhouse gases and see what the extra effect on the atmosphere is associated with those changes. So that's incorporated in as well. Now, I think that was the last question that had been sent prior to this meeting, but oh no, we've got some more. Interesting differences in the PED drought susceptibility between catchments. To what degree is that based on land cover and topography? The PED is actually, I mean, it's a relatively simple measure of a drought indicator. It takes into account rainfall coming in, evapotranspiration going out of the soil. Now, evapotranspiration is a combination of evaporation, of loss of moisture directly, as well as transpiration, which is the loss of moisture through the transpiring of vegetation. So in a way that has got a vegetation element in that calculation, but it is still a pretty simple, crude type of indicator. So it's more, what the patterns that we were showing is actually more general climatic conditions rather than related to very specific things like the land cover or vegetation cover. So I guess one way to interpret that then is that if you've got a catchment that is grass or scrub versus another catchment that is more native forest, for example, manuka, for example, then you probably need to sort of interpret those maps differently that are that a grass or a scrub type of environment is likely to be more drought prone because it's more easily loses the moisture through evapotranspiration than a forested or a native or exotic forested land cover does. So I guess in a roundabout way of answering your question, these numbers don't really take into account that vegetation difference. And we have to kind of interpret those numbers based on our own understanding of what the vegetation does in terms of evapotranspiration. Does that help, I hope? Oh, another question. Have the models 100-year return period estimates are based on being revised given the weather events in the region over the last 10 years? Yeah. Are they consistently being updated? Yep. Or only periodically? Yeah, it's more periodic update. So the tool that I put on the slide there, there was a website called HIRDS, HIRDS .niwa.co.nz. So HIRDS stands for High Intensity Rainfall Design System. And this is the numbers that you can generate from that tool are based on actual rainfalls that we've recorded over sometimes 100 years in a region. And we use extreme value analysis to try to understand what these 1% AEPs or 2% or 3% for different time periods, like the 1 hour rainfall, the 2 hour rainfall, the 24-hour rainfall, etc., is for that particular location. So HIRDS is updated periodically. So the last time HIRDS was updated was in 2018, and we are seeking a way forward right at the moment to update HIRDS again, because obviously between 2018 and now we've had some rather large rainfalls. So those that reanalysis of the historic rainfalls in terms of the extreme weather analysis, extreme value analysis will make a difference to those numbers. So it is important that we keep up to date as best we can. It's quite a sizable piece of work to do, and it takes quite a bit of effort, and hence we're looking for ways of doing that work and getting support from various funding agencies to do it. So the answer is periodically. If in a ideal world, you would be doing this very, very regularly. We don't have quite that ideal world. So in the way that the science system in New Zealand operates, so we can only try to do it as frequently as we possibly can. Kia ora. As a young person in the Tairāwhiti, what are some effective things we can do to help the environment? And what can we do to help our communities? Yeah, that's a great question. So there's kind of two sides to this. The driving problem, the biggest problem with climate change is putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere in the first place. So we've been burning fossil fuels, coal and oil for a long time, and emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere for a long, long time. And it's built up to, definitely higher numbers than we've had over the last, 10,000 years even. And it still goes up and up, right? And so we need to reduce those emissions, globally. This is the big effort of things like, the Paris Accord, these various conference of the parties. They're called COP meetings of all of the nations in the world getting together every year to try to work out how we can continually drive down those emissions globally, so that we really do stop or reduce the key problem, which is increasing these gases in their atmosphere. So, I mean, and that comes all the way down from the global effort to the national efforts, to the regional efforts, to the city efforts, and even to the community efforts. I mean, everybody has got a sort of a responsibility, if you like, and a part to play in reducing our carbon footprint that we have globally. So in my mind, one of the absolute most important things that everybody can be doing as a sort of a team effort is identifying ways that we can, stop emitting or reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases. So that's one role, and that can be done individually or in a sort of from a community basis. The other side of the coin is that we are already seeing these impacts of climate change, like warmer conditions, for example. And so we can also do things to be more resilient to those types of climate impacts, the ones that we're already seeing, like hot days and droughty conditions and extreme rainfall. So what can we do to, I guess, be less vulnerable to these types of events? Now, that might mean, looking at the ways that we use our land to farm or grow crops or grow trees, etc. Is that the are we using our land so that in the best way so that we have got the greatest resilience to these types of climate changes that we're seeing? And that type of thing can also be done at a personal community level, as well as really getting involved in discussions more at that regional level with various entities like council, like large businesses, etc. And then when there's a chance to put our name or tick a box in a local election or something, we can be influencing who are making decisions about land use or increasing our resilience to the impacts of climate change by voting for the people that we feel are going to have the have that as high on their priority list. So there are all sorts of ways that individuals can contribute and feel like we are actually able to do something about this. Kia ora. It's the second edition of the Gisborne report, an update of the 2020 NIWA report that included climate scenarios for Hawke's Bay and Tairāwhiti. Yeah, so the maps that I showed you in this presentation are based on that Gisborne and Hawke's Bay report that was done in 2020. We are now like on the cusp. By June this year, we will have a brand new suite of climate projections for all of New Zealand. And this is work that's been going on for the last 2.5 years. It's quite a big effort to update all of the climate maps for New Zealand based on the very latest global models. And be consistent with the very latest reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. They put out their 6th assessment report a couple of years ago. So with all of this new information that is due to be released in the next month or so, there's an opportunity to update all of those maps for everywhere around New Zealand. And so we'll be talking to the Gisborne District Council as well as Hawke's Bay Regional Council and all the councils around New Zealand about whether they would like NIWA to update all of those reports based on the new data. The other thing that's changed with all of this, these latest models, is that the emission pathways, they were called these representative concentration pathways, have now been sort of refreshed as well and are called shared socioeconomic pathways. So there's a bit of a change in the way that around the language of these new information. So it's really important that the types of reports, the regional reports that we've done, also describe what it means in terms of that change in the language. Essentially, we'll have similar type of information of future changes for different periods and different scenarios, but it will be a little bit different than what we've had in the past. But yeah, the goal is to well, the information will be available soon, and then the goal is to ask all of the councils whether they would like updated reports, and so one would hope that they will. Last question. You must feel a sense of pride when your modelling is applied to policy changes and future climate planning and implementation. Which economic sectors and regions are making the best use of your models? I do get an immense sense of pride. It's one of the key, I guess, core purpose or core responsibilities of an agency like NIWA, that we've got this responsibility for updating all of these climate projections or producing this information that is then, we hope, being applied and implemented, not just policy, but also for business decisions, for everything associated with, longer term planning, if you like. So yeah, it's really important in my mind that we have an agency like ourselves that are doing this, providing this fundamental information, and we do see it getting used everywhere, really. So for example, Wakakatahi, New Zealand Transport Authority, when they were looking at all of the damage that was caused by Cyclone Gabrielle across all of, from Northland to Coromandel to Bay of Plenty to East Cape to across Tairāwhiti and Hawke's Bay and even into Tairāwhiti district and Wairarapa, for example, they've incorporated projections of future extreme rainfall events into their planning for how they repair or replace, or even in some upgrade the national transport network. So it's being used in that sort of future proofing when things need fixing or upgrading across the spectrum of infrastructure development, for example. These projections get used a lot by, for example, the Department of Conservation when they're trying to understand, how they can continue to protect New Zealand's native biodiversity and what various native species might be vulnerable to these types of climate changes. And if they are, then what are the actions that the department can do to, increase the resilience of the habitats, especially of these types of, native species. The information is being used for urban planning. So in Wellington, for example, where I'm sitting, there's a lot of work that's done on the sort of 10 to 20 year planning cycle, and things like coastal erosion and sea level rise projections are taken into account for those plans for urban development. Where are the key areas in Wellington that are expected to change in terms of the way that the nature of the buildings that will be there, or the access to the emergency services or key infrastructure like hospitals. So climate change information is being used in that sense as well. And I get the sense that more and more now across the board, decisions that are being made or plans that are being put into place that particularly include a long-term cycle, a long-term planning horizon, are using climate change projections as one of the sets of information for making those plans. It's so I'm not sure I can pick on a particular region or sector or anything. It's more an embracing of this information across the board, which is extremely satisfying, actually. So and really it is the way forward for all of that sort of long-term planning process. Kia ora. So yeah, well, so thank you very much. So that was, I think, the last question. Look, I just want to again say thanks for giving me this opportunity to present to you today. I hope that the information was somewhat useful, and particularly those resources that I presented to you in terms of where you can get more information. I encourage you to have a look at those. And the lovely question about what we can do individually and as part of the community, I think this is something I think all of us can be asking ourselves all the time about what we can do and how we can involve those folks around us and what influence we can have. Because really, we do have to do everything we can to do both of those things I mentioned. Reduce our emissions as well as do everything we can to be less vulnerable to the impacts that we are already seeing and are likely to continue to see. So, like with that, just like to say thank you again, and kia ora.